So we'll now shift directly into a session called Why International Aid Matters. And first, we'll have Karen share a little bit of context, an introduction to why we're having this conversation. And then we have a video and then a number of other resources and a conversation with our director, Guy. So Karen, I will turn it over to you. And do forgive me, everyone. I'm trying to figure out how I can see people at the same time. But there's no slides to go on with what Karen's saying. So I don't think we'll be too turned off by that. So Karen, you can go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction to this session. I don't want to step on Guy's toes too much and cover things that he's planning to cover, but just do a little bit of context setting about why we are having this conversation right now. Obviously, discussions about international aid is something that PWS&D has historically cared about and continues to care about, as you know, it's essential to the work that we do. But one of the things that we can't miss right now is the news that's going on about the cuts that President Trump has made in the US to USAID. According to the United Nations, US contributions prior to the cuts accounted for more than 40% of all humanitarian aid tracked by the UN in 2024. US cuts to foreign aid are really only part of the story, though. Cuts to foreign assistance have been taking place in many developing countries, including the UK, Germany, Sweden, and Belgium, as more countries seem to be looking inward and as there is more of a protectionist slant happening in more places. The current government in Canada has also indicated not necessarily a great deal of support for increasing funding for international assistance, though their party platform did indicate a commitment to maintain funding at its current level. So the question then becomes about what impact this has and what does international assistance actually do. And prior to Guy talking, we're going to share a brief video from Canadian Food Grains Bank put together that helps illustrate some of the actual impact of international assistance around the world.
So now I invite Guy to share with us.
Thank you, Emma and Karen. Nice to see you all from faraway coast to the Smoky Prairies to Montreal, and it's nice to see such a broad range together today. So yeah, why does international aid matter? That's the challenge that I was given to talk about, and I will share my screen or attempt to do so. So, in thinking about this, my first instinct is to just go back to the basics. I mean, we just saw a number of images that are self-explanatory as to why aid is important. And yeah, the reality is that we live in a world that is highly unjust in so many ways. And that's why I spent my whole life essentially working in this business because there is this high inequality that exists in the world, and we are called to try to make a difference in evening out the playing field. But let's dig into that a little bit. The church has a statement of Christian belief, and I think that's where, for us, it starts. In our Living Faith document, there are 2 pages that specifically, to me, call us to act. And On page 24 is a section on love, and it says, love means seeking the best for others and is the mark of a Christian. Love for God leads to love for others, and we cannot claim to love God, whom we do not see, if we hate those about us who we do see. Love of God and love of neighbor fulfills the law of God. I apologize for the bad layout on my slides here. It's because somehow PowerPoint likes to try to help with these designs, but then they mess up your layout. So thinking about love, you know, it starts there as to why aid matters. On page 25 in that same Living Faith document that the church has put together, we have a section on justice. And there it says, God is always calling the church to seek that justice in the world. That justice which reflects the divine righteousness revealed in the Bible. God's justice is seen when we deal fairly with each other and strive to change customs and practices that oppress and enslave others. Justice involves also protecting the rights of others. It protests against everything that destroys human dignity. Justice requires concern for the poor of the world. It seeks the best way to create well-being in every society. It's concerned about employment, education, and health, as well as rights and responsibilities. So I encourage you to use those quotes when you speak sometimes, because it goes back to the roots of why we are called to action and what we have stated as a church that we're all about in our statement of Christian belief. Yeah, so moving on from here, why was I first called to get involved in international development? Well, it's because I realized that there's a lot of inequality in this world, like I said before. And I just want us to look a little bit at something called the Human Development Index. And some of you are probably familiar with this. Others may be a little bit less, but we'll do a little exercise here. And we'll start with a short video that maybe Emma can line up for us on what is the Human Development Index. That it's a composite index that's used to rank countries based on three basic dimensions of human development. One is health, that is measured by life expectancy at birth, and second one is knowledge, that's measured by the expected years of schooling, and the third is standard of living, which is measured by the gross national income per capita in a country.
All right.
What is Human Development Index? Imagine you're grading a country's success in three main subjects. Health. This is like checking how healthy the people are in that country. We do this by looking at how long people usually live there. Longer life expectancy means people are generally healthier and have better access to healthcare. Education. This part is about how well educated the people are. We look at two things: how many years adults have spent in school on average and how many years kids are expected to go to school. More education usually means people have more opportunities and can make better choices in life, standard of living. This is like checking how well off the people are in terms of money. We look at the average income per person in the country. It's not just about how much money people make, but also about what they can afford with that money, like food, housing, and other important stuff. So the Human Development Index is like adding up these grades to give the country an overall score. This score helps us understand how well a country is doing in terms of how healthy, educated, and financially secure its people are. Higher scores mean the country is doing better overall, and lower scores mean there's more work to be done.
Thank you, Emma. Don't know if you guys caught that from the beginning or yes? Okay. Because it seems like I was sharing the screen at the same time and I wasn't seeing the video starting, so. All right. So now we'll go and move on to a little exercise. All right. So here are a list here's a list of countries where PWS&D has partners, and I want us to try to guess the ranking of these countries on the Human Development Index, and we'll see how well we did. So Canada is in the top 20, is 16. 20 years ago, we were actually close to number one, actually. But we've kind of been falling down a little bit, and I guess we're still very well within the countries that are in high levels of development. Guatemala, 137, so it's not actually in the bottom 30. And Nicaragua is very close at 123. Haiti is obviously lower at 166, which is very similar to Malawi when you see the level of poverty that is there. Nepal at 145. I think someone said 140. That was pretty. Steve, I think, mentioned that. Was pretty close. India, as we can see, is not in the bottom 20. However, if we look at Bihar, which is one of the states where we have programming, and Maria just came back from there, that would actually fall in the bottom 20. So that was a pretty good guess, but it also looks at the targeting that we do within the country. In Pakistan ranks at 168, actually, as you can see, and Sindh, being the province where we do most of our programming, is at 176. So really close to the bottom, and I think it's Karen who said Afghanistan would be very close to the bottom, and yeah, as I don't remember, there might be one country or two that are below, but yeah, pretty tough place. And 186 in brackets, there is the province of Bamiyan, where we are doing most of our programming these days. So all to say, this would all be fine if all these 180 countries were all in the high development bracket. And we would just say, like in a race, we just say, well, someone's got to win, but we're all doing fine. Well, the reality is not such. And these countries, Canada, of course, is the only one who's in the highest development bracket, and then all the other ones are either in the low, medium to low development bracket. So that is the call for us to act and try to work on aid. So now I want us to look a little bit at um, Canada as a donor country. What does that look like? Canada promised to increase its official development assistance until 2030 to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but that promise was broken in 2024. The increases that we saw recently in the last few years were mostly due to the COVID response and to the Ukraine crisis. So we did see a blip in Canada's contributions, but they were very specific to these two situations. So spending on development, peace, and security in 2022, 2023 was 6.4 billion in the Canadian budget, but you can see that in 2025, 2026, it's down to 4.9 billion, and it's not on track to increase anywhere. We can look at a chart that I have as well here. Here we can see Canada's total development spending and prioritization of development in millions of dollars US and a percentage of its gross national income. So you can see that 2019 was 0.27%, and it went up to 2024, and then back down now to 0.27%, which is where it was prior to 2020, and which is essentially 1/3 of where we hope it would be at the 0.7% that has been set as a target a long time ago, and that Canada spearheaded as a target for the world to achieve. So we're not there, and our work as a sector, we need to keep on mentioning it and keep on claiming the place that we have to go be in the world. And like Karen said, although the current government wants to maintain levels of aid, which is a good sign for now. We haven't seen a budget yet for this year, so we'll have to see when that comes out in the fall. But we also know that during the campaign for the elections, some parties were asking to drastically cut aid, if not eliminate aid, in order for us to build up our defense, for example. And those kinds of talks are very dangerous as far as our role in the world, and very much inward looking. Um, do you see this scrolling on my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So just to look at this is a report that I found on the internet on a site called donortracker.org, and it shows Canada's spending by sector as well. So we can see there's a whole lot that's unspecified in this, but then we can see refugees and donor countries, health and populations, emergency response, and then a number of other sectors, including education, agriculture, conflict, peace and security, and going down to water and sanitation and a whole bunch of others. So that's kind of the breakdown of our official development assistance by different sectors. Okay, so Emma, we have a couple of other videos there, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, I'd like to look at the one from Oxfam.
Aid makes a difference to the lives of the poorest people around the world. It is a vital way to help lift millions of people out of poverty. With healthy and educated people, poor countries can develop their economies and stand on their own 2 feet. Some people argue that aid actually prevents countries from developing. Some people think that it should be stopped. But thanks to money from rich country donors, in the last few years, we've seen 1.4 million extra HIV-positive people on life-saving antiretroviral drugs. 40 million children who never could have learned to read and write are now getting an education. Aid has helped to make these things happen. If given correctly, aid can help to reduce corruption. The money can be spent in a way that empowers people in developing countries to speak up, tell their governments what they need, and hold them accountable for how aid money is spent. In 1970, rich country leaders pledged to give 0.7% of their country's income in international aid. That means they still have over 99% of their income to spend on housing, transport, jobs, or anything else they need to. Even though this is a tiny amount, only a small number of European countries are on track to meet this commitment. To put that into perspective, the UK spends 5 times more on military than it does on aid. And in the US, people spend double the amount on pet food per year. There is still a long way to go to eradicate poverty, but if rich countries stick to their aid promises, then millions more people will get an education, receive treatment when they need it, and be able to lift themselves out of poverty. In this way, more and more people's lives are changed, and in the end, with a healthy and educated population, poor countries will stand on their own 2 feet and aid will become a thing of the past.
Aid will become a thing of the past. So that's great, but that would be when people are all living lives with dignity and fulfilled when their needs. So not because aid is just cut at once, as we are experiencing now in many parts of the world. So I like this video because it has that message that, you know, ideally we want to get to a point where aid is no longer needed. But in the meantime, there's a great need to have this solidarity and to help to build people's lives so they can get out of poverty. And unfortunately, the type of situations we are seeing in the world, that many of them are created by humans, or like conflict and so on, that are creating a lot of misery in so many places, that just increase the needs for aid, humanitarian assistance, and so on. And we're not really talking about that, you know. So we're hearing discourses of, oh, we have homeless people in Canada. You know, we have water problems in our native communities in Canada. So we can't afford to help people in other countries. Well, the reality is, like, we have enough resources to be able to do both. It doesn't have to be an either or. Um, the issues that we have in Canada are there because our politicians have just not made those issues a priority. So it's not because of aid, and that discourse does not take more traction than it does because people are trying to poison people's minds that way. It's like in this video we just saw, in the US, these people spend twice as much on pet food than on aid. Um, I have nothing against pet food, by the way, because I have a very cherished dog, and I managed to feed my dog and also to make contributions to humanitarian assistance and development work in the world. So I don't think it has to be an either or. It's just to recognize that those are two important needs, and we want to fulfill both. So as a society, and when we interact with our elected officials or those who are running for office, I think we have to present those challenges to them and say, why are you trying to pitch this as a neither or situation? You know, you can build a defense base in northern Canada without jeopardizing our aid budget. Just like you can build a tunnel under the 401 and not jeopardize our aid budget. Like, it's a question of how you decide to put your priorities and where you put your resources. But um, all this to say, we as a collective of people and agencies who work in international development, we want to make sure that our voices are heard and continue to be heard on this topic. And in the US, like the way that things have gone since Donald Trump took power, it's a very drastic change. And I'm going to shift the conversation now towards that and the impact that this is having. Um, First of all, it's a huge shock to a lot of the sector in the world, in ways that are just beginning to be felt in so many places, but that will have very deep implications in the long term, um, which calls us to not follow suit, but to try to step up our game as a Canadian society and maybe show that this is an important value for us and that we don't believe in the way it's going in other places. It's going to be a big struggle. Um, but let me see. I think could you line up the CTV video? So there was an interview with Kate Higgins, who's the executive director of Cooperation Canada, which is formerly called the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. And PWS&D is a member of this coalition. And she was interviewed on CTV about the US cuts. And maybe we'll look at that. It's only about 4 minutes.
Sure, sounds good.
Foreign aid agencies are calling on Canada to fill the gaps from the Trump administration's freeze on the U.S. Agency for International Development. So the U.S. distributed more than $40 billion through USAID in 2023. And since the freeze this year, $40 million worth of projects co-funded by Canada have now been left in limbo. And while the freeze on USAID is sparking concerns of humanitarian crises, some experts are saying this is an opportunity for countries like ours to step up and fill the void. For more on Canada's role, I'm joined by Kate Higgins, CEO of Cooperation Canada. Good morning.
Good morning.
Kate, can you share with us some examples of how this freeze has affected Canadian agencies on the ground and some of the projects that they were in the middle of so far?
Well, let's first take a step back and really understand the global impact of this very immediate, very abrupt, and very disruptive pause and freeze on US aid. It is having devastating impacts on millions of people's lives around the world. For example, we know that around 20 million people have lost access to absolutely crucial HIV medicine. We know that in Uganda, there was an Ebola outbreak and there was not the adequate infectious disease support on the ground. We know in Syria and Myanmar, people who are displaced due to war do not have essential humanitarian relief. And we know that there are warehouses around the world where emergency food aid and emergency medicines are sitting and spoiling. So, as I said, it was a very immediate, very disruptive pause, freeze on US aid that is having ripple effects across the global system. Now, if we think about what that means for Canadian organizations, it means that organizations that received funding from USAID cannot continue that work. We know, for example, a really great program run by the University of Manitoba supporting people living with HIV/AIDS in Kenya has had to come to an end. We know that there was a great project supporting displaced people in Mali, emergency food aid, emergency housing that was deeply affected. So this is having ripple effects across the global humanitarian system and having impacts on Canadian organizations.
I was speaking with a friend of mine this week who works for an NGO saying that literally trucks that were en route with aid and farming equipment were told to turn around and people went to their offices and the doors were locked. Like, that's how abrupt this work has stopped. You are among those who are calling for Canada to fill in the gaps that are left now. What happens if we don't step up?
Well, if we don't step up, millions of people's lives are literally on the line. Now, let us be clear. The US was such a significant funder of the global aid and humanitarian system, and we should not expect Canada to completely fill that gap. But there are things that we could do. For example, current projects that are on the ground could be revised, could be changed to fit particular gaps. We also should be looking, as Canada, if there are areas where we have particular expertise, particularly strong geographic links, where we could make an injection of support to contribute to filling this devastating gap. So there are absolutely things that we can do. Now, in a very disruptive global context, this is the right thing to do for the humanitarian reasons I've explained, but it's also strategic in this highly disrupted geopolitical context for Canada to be stepping up, for Canada to be engaging in the world. A safer world, a freer world, a more prosperous world is good for the world, but it's also good for Canada.
Canada's foreign aid spending, we know, is decreasing. So the numbers from Global Affairs Canada show a drop in our spending from $5.6 billion in 2024 to a projected $4.4 billion for 2026-27. Is Canada in a fiscal position to fill the gap that's been left by the U.S.?
As I said, we are not in a position to completely fill the gap left by the US. But I do think, and we do believe, that strategic investments are the right thing to do and the strategic thing to do. This is a moment for us to step up. This is a moment for us to engage with partners across the world who need some gaps filled. This is an opportunity for us to be building economies, for us to be contributing to stability, for us to be opening markets for Canadian businesses. So there are absolutely things that we can do. This is a strategic moment, as I said, in a very, very disruptive, complex world where international assistance, when strategically deployed, can make a real difference and is in our interest.
Kate Higgins, CEO of Cooperation Canada, thank you for your time this morning.
Thanks so much.
So last year it dispersed $61 billion in foreign assistance, and just over half of that was via USAID. So the impact of those aid cuts, according to Oxfam again, that at least 23 million children stand to lose access to education. 95 million people stand to lose access to basic health care, which can potentially lead to more than 3 million preventable deaths per year. Maternal, newborn, and child health is a sector that's also deeply affected. We have made, as a community, great progress on this topic, and PWS&D has been part of this story in the last decade. But since 1990, under 5 years old deaths, um, those rates dropped by 50% since 1990. So we've made some tremendous progress on children's death rates. On maternal death rates, they've dropped by 40% just in the last 5 years. And I mean, that's a result of 50 years of work on this type of thematic. But those successes can also just be lost very quickly if continued investment is not there and if those cuts happen so drastically at once, like what we're experiencing right now. So they were saying that recent cuts to USAID awards include 86% of the maternal and child health programming. Um, how are PWS&D partners affected by these aid cuts? Well, here are a few examples. Hospitals in Malawi have been affected by the cuts, primarily because of the cuts to HIV and AIDS services. Our partners Amni La Santé in Haiti, although they don't receive direct money from USAID, they are deeply concerned about the destabilizing effect that these cuts will have on a country that's already in great turmoil. So it just worsens the whole situation in a country like Haiti. In Guatemala, 8,000 medical personnel jobs were cut because they were linked to getting funding through USAID or through the United Nations that were funded by US. So this has an impact on the population, meaning that they have less access to healthcare, and only those who can afford to get to private clinics can get the healthcare. So it has these types of impacts on our partners. But generally, most of our partners were not receiving USAID funds directly, so their programs are not directly affected as they might be in other cases. The ACT Alliance, of which PWS&D is a member, and I sit on the board of the ACT Alliance, it did a survey amongst its members in March to assess the impact of these US cuts around the world. And because the ACT Alliance has members all over the planet and in more than, I guess, 100 countries, I think. So doing this survey helped to identify some of the impacts as well. 48 agencies responded to the survey, and they mentioned that 2/3 of respondents had to suspend or scale back programs. 44% reported that they had staff layoffs or had to reduce salaries. Projects and office closures. A third of them, those who filled the survey, reported closures of offices and a lot of uncertainty, and members finding ways to save projects and offices in other cases. So there are definitely impacts that are being felt across the alliance. And programs that are affected, they include humanitarian development, climate and peace building efforts. And those that are mostly affected are humanitarian relief, gender justice, climate resilience, education, healthcare, and conflict resolution and peace building. And you can see the percentages there. So obviously, as we mentioned, USAID just provides a whole lot of resources. But it's not only USAID, it's also cuts that have happened in Europe before Trump did his own cuts. There's already a movement in Europe that is that has been going in that direction. So it's an important topic for us to continue to look at. Impacts on the communities that ACT Alliance serves, reduce access to education, erosion of climate adaptation and resilience programming, um, violation of the right to food, water, and shelter, heightened risks for women, children, and vulnerable groups, increased inequality and marginalization, and then we have threats to human rights and dignity in those communities. So the advocacy capacity, displacement and migration, increased food insecurity, reduced access to healthcare, and climate disaster vulnerability. So in that context, there were some priorities that were named that the ACT Alliance should take into consideration. Number one being advocacy at this time, political commitments and narratives on aid versus security, as I mentioned earlier, supporting grassroots and church advocacy, program priorities on climate, life-saving aid, long-term solutions. As a second priority, to mobilize funding to support impacted local partners and communities, and then to strengthen partnerships as a network and with national and local partners, and then to diversify funding sources, including non-traditional and private sector, so that we may be able to raise more funding, such as from foundations and so on. And yeah, so those are the thoughts I wanted to share with you. And I know
Excellent.
it's a lot at once, but at the same time, I think it's important that we take stock of these different voices and realities and concerns that are happening at this time, and to see the importance of PWS&D's work in this context, both on our advocacy in Canada and on supporting our partners overseas. But I'm opening the floor to any comments or questions, concerns.
Yeah, so if anyone feels comfortable to unmute, you're welcome to ask a question that way or to type it into the chat, and myself or Karen can put it to Guy.
I was wondering how well Presbyterians are contributing this year. Do you have a sense? Is it too early to say how we are contributing to PWS&D?
Karen, I don't know if you have insights on this.
Sure, I can talk about it a little bit. So May is not the best time to know exactly how the year is going to go because so many donations come into PWS&D at the end of the year. All that said, though, we know that in 2024, Presbyterians responded really generously and were maintaining contributions. So it wasn't an increase over 2023, but it was pretty stable 2023 to 2024. So we hope to see the same in 2025. But yeah, it's a little early to know how this year is going to be. There's not a lot of giving that happens in the first half of the year.
One of the challenges that we're having is the fact that we have there are so many disasters happening in the world at this point that we're having the challenge of trying to have appeals that help to raise resources for humanitarian assistance in many places where the needs are great, but uh, we're not getting the type of donations for humanitarian assistance as we had when when there's a big natural disaster that happens that gets very prominently featured in the media. So it's been a bit difficult on that front. But otherwise, our support base is there, and we just, yeah, we're struggling with that a bit.
Yeah, jumping off of what Guy said, I think one of the things we're seeing is that more and more of the humanitarian situations that we're seeing in the world are chronic emergencies as opposed to like a rapid onset emergency, like an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that, where people see the need immediately to respond because there's an immediate onset reason for it. But the reality is, a lot of the ongoing emergencies in the world right now have been going on in some places for over a decade. If you think about need in Syria or Yemen or South Sudan or Somalia or Ethiopia, or like some of these situations have been going on, yeah, for over a decade. And how do you maintain that momentum, or how do you help people understand that there's still emergency need in so many places for situations that have been going on for so long? And it's a challenge for us and how we talk about it.
There's a question in the chat from Beth. Are we seeing the same declines in individual charitable giving to international aid as we're seeing in government commitments? Well, in Canada, we're not yet seeing drops in charitable donations, and that's in part because the part of the population that gives to charities is an aging population who is committed to continue to give to charities. So the number of donors is decreasing. The level of givings is still going well for the sector as a whole, is what I hear. But with the uncertainties with the economy and all that, and what's happening with the tariffs and those threats to our economy, mean that it's becoming less predictable as to whether or not people will feel the same level of comfort and giving as they were before. So we're sensitive to that, and hope that our government will be able to defend our economy as good as well as possible, and that will sustain the charitable givings. But yeah, I mean, in the short term, we're not too concerned that way, but in the longer term or medium term, because of the aging donor base in Canada in general for all charities, not just for PWS&D, but in many sectors, there's this uncertainty around charitable giving because it's not as strong a part of the younger people's culture as it is the older people's culture.
And tied to that is also just demographics about church attendance and where a lot of people learn about giving, which is through involvement in a church community. And as fewer younger people are attending church, there's also that element of like modeling that isn't happening, or where people aren't learning that same piece about giving in the same way. Steve asked a question about in the chat. I don't know how many others were contacted by Canadian Food Grains Bank in advance of the election. One of the things they were asking people to do was to contact candidates, to leave messages on the phone, to contact candidates and also elected officials, telling them that aid mattered. So Steve was asking about the response. I know a little bit about the response, and then I would have to get more details from CFGB. But what I do know is that they had quite good uptake on people who were asked to contact their candidates doing so. There's something that feels easier, I think, for people to call and leave a message on an answering machine than to think about having to go visit their candidate. And one of the things that they were hearing was that there were definitely candidates who were saying these were messages that we heard. One of the challenges that was happening across the country, though, was that so many Conservative candidates weren't showing up for all candidates meetings. So it wasn't that like you couldn't ask questions of all of the parties then because the candidates just weren't showing up. So that was definitely a challenge. And then also, so hearing back reporting as well from Conservative candidates just wasn't happening again because some of the blanket moratoriums on speaking to the press from the Conservative Party. So it was a bit harder to hear about what issues Conservative candidates were hearing about. We do know that candidates reported that they were hearing about the messages, and I know that it's a strategy that CFGD is going to try again in future.
Thanks, Karen. I'll give a little beat here if there are any final questions before we move on to our next activity.
I just want to say that there's, I'm open for questions, but there's another thing that is out there is like people having this impression that it's a wastage of money to put money towards aid, and that there's a lot of like the aid goes to corrupt systems, and those kinds of discourses are out there too, and they fire up on social media. Um, and the reality is that that's not true. I mean, obviously, there are cases when a certain percentage of aid goes for things that shouldn't have gone to. But if you compare to other sectors, construction sector, name so many other sectors where one could name a whole lot of corruption and systems that are not perfect. So I wouldn't say the aid system is perfect by far, but the reality is that what I've seen as figures that a good solid 80% of the all of aid money that is contributed in the world does go for the actual purpose that it's designated for, and the levels that don't or that end up in some kind of corruption or whatever is small percentages, and I think that's not a case to be saying that we should be cutting off like completely aid in the world. I mean, it's a case of just saying, make sure that your systems are strong, that you can prevent corruption, that you're not directly supporting corrupt systems, and I would say that the sector of private NGOs like us, I mean, we're not an NGO as such, but agencies like ours, we are part of alliances, and we have systems that don't prevent 100%, any kind of wrongdoing, but at the same time, the percentages that may be at play can be very, very small compared to, say, the government of Canada giving money to another government for their Ministry of Health or something like that. I mean, that's a whole different setup, and the accountability systems are very different. I mean, we are. Well, you can actually now have access to our audited financial statements. We get audited, our partners get audited. We work through an alliance that has its own accountability systems, like with the ACT Alliance or with Canadian Food Grains Bank. There's a whole lot of checks and balances that are in place. So I think this is what we have to tell people as well when anybody is bringing up those stories of corruption or things like, well, not in our world, like, that's not the reality that we experience, and I would say that goes for the vast majority of the members of Cooperation Canada and so on. So we have to nuance those things. And I couldn't believe that video that we saw with the CTV interview with Kate Higgins. I could see on YouTube comments that some people had made. And it's horrible just to see the kind of discourse out there. They're like, bring Dodge to Canada, we can't have all this wastage happening in Canada and all that kind of stuff. And people write these comments on a video like that when it's uncalled for, but it's also uncontrolled, right? So I think it's our duty to also counteract those voices when we can.
And that is an excellent segue, Guy, because we are now going to do an activity. So for everyone on this call, whether you have a pen or pencil and a paper handy, or just using your computer on a note somewhere to write this down, but feel free to take a moment to get what you need. Some of you were told that in advance anyway. Here's a scenario for you, and then you have a job to do. So say tomorrow you give a presentation at church on the work of PWS&D, as many champions do, or many missions committee chairs, things like that. After the service, someone comes up to you, and I had a little bit more gentle phrasing, and Guy gave what sometimes the phrasing actually is, didn't he? So your choice, which question you respond to. So the person comes up to you and they say, is it really important to support international aid? The way that Guy phrased it, which honestly sometimes might be what you hear, isn't that a waste of my money? Or something like that. So someone comes up to you and they say that. Take a moment now and actually, because I think it's a good exercise for us, actually write out, what would you say to respond to them? All right, I see the knitting needles coming back up. That means we're ready in in your household there, Nora. Is there anyone who would like to begin? Anyone who'd like to share theirs? Yes, Ellis.
Sure, I'll give it a try. Be kind to me. It's important for everyone, both in Canada, government and citizens, to give to these people, for the recipients. It strengthens alliances through supportive education, building strong communities locally, universally, leads to better social supports in these countries. Teachers, medical, nurses, doctors, medically related fields, further education, research, farming. All of this is supported. The foods grown are the foods that are regional to that area. This leads then to markets where people can go and sell, and it gives a stronger economy, a sustainable food source. Families become self-sufficient, healthier, better able to work, better able to study, better able to become entrepreneurial. And it gives the donor country and the recipient countries respect for one another and respect globally. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I have a mute button on my microphone as well. Thank you, Ellis. I especially appreciated how you itemized all those different things. I think a few of us around the circle did. Yeah. Anyone else who'd like to share? Yes, thank you.
I can share a little bit about what Chris and I were talking about. So I wrote, as a Christian, God instructs us to love our neighbors. And it's our responsibility to share with our neighbors financially to help provide them a safe environment for medical needs, for hunger, and for education.
Thank you, Linda. Yeah, absolutely. And we have time for, I think, one more. Yes, Heather. Oh, two more. I'll give in. Heather and then Kelvin.
Supporting aid is crucial to saving lives. It provides education to empower people in their life choices. And aid helps to build safe and resilient communities. Supporting aid helps in contributing to a safer and peaceful and more healthy world for everyone.
Thank you. And Kelvin.
Yeah, I would say I don't think giving aid is a waste of money because people are never a waste of love. We give because we love. And as a Christian, I believe every human bears the image of God. So is aid a waste of money? It is a waste of money if only you believe that people are disposable. And if you believe that every person is a divine carrier of potential, then giving is not just generosity, but it is believing in the potential that God has put in every human being.
Amen. Thank you, Kelvin. Are we all feeling equipped if someone asks us at church tomorrow? I think so. There might even be a couple, I don't know, blog posts or newsletter articles or something that might come out of this now that we've all started to ponder it, and especially the implication of our faith, right? So on that note, I think it would be fitting to close this particular session in a prayer. I'll just pray off the cuff here that God would use us in these situations to help people come to understand. So let's pray together. Dear Lord, I thank you for the opportunity to learn together today. I thank you for the words of Guy and others who shared with us today about how important it is to love our neighbors. We ask that you would use us in our communities to raise awareness of how vital international aid is. And we do ask now for your hand over those in leadership in our country and in other countries as they make these important decisions that affect people's lives. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.